When there is a prominent pastor caught in adultery, there's a few types of reactions that I see from Christians online which I think are, ultimately, misguided. I'm going to give phrases that I've seen in response to such events, but it's not really about the words or the phrases themselves. It's the heart's attitude of those words which matter. I've been trying to make a video on this for a couple weeks or so now, and I've had a general script ready, but I felt like I just wasn't expressing the intuitions I've had about this quite to my liking. At last, I have some thoughts. You might think they're foolish, but this is what I think. There are some who will be very vocal in their disgust with these pastors, who will often say, "I would never do that to my wife." However, people who feel like they have been helped a lot by these pastors will often defend them and say, anyone could fall into these sins. Essentially, the people who say "I would never do that" should be much more careful with their words. Regardless of what your own thoughts are on these two specific attitudes, one thing is clear. For most people within the broader world of Christianity, if it was a pastor they liked, they are likelier to be more defensive or even apologetic with their scandals, or at least they will stay silent. But if it's a pastor they dislike, they're quick to pile on to the public train of condemnation. But as I said, I'm not a fan of either of these responses, though there is merit to both of them, which should be pretty obvious, so I'm not going to bother going into it. For those who say in their hearts, "I would never do that," that's something that others might resonate with. But in the end, oftentimes that's what the very pastors that follow themselves did. They said the same things. They referenced their own temporary triumph over such actions as points of comparison. But more importantly, I personally have the sense that it's fundamentally unhealthy to spend too much energy in condemnation of another, especially using what you would or would not do as a point of comparison. I would expect this sense comes from my belief that purity is not an end in itself. If the point of life were simply to restrict yourself from doing things, where's the blessing in that? And who outside of yourself does that bless? More on that later. And that leads to the response that it could be anyone who falls into sin at a moment's notice. These things aren't really planned. And the merit in this response is that it keeps us humbled. It helps us realize that we aren't invincible to temptations. But ultimately, what do we give power to in these words? The power of sin? Should men see other men being unfaithful and then become eternally shaken with fear that they could cheat on their wives? Think about what your heart is saying. It could be any of us next. We don't want to live in fear. We don't want people to be fearful while entering into marriage, or to fear marriage itself. Instead, we want to live in love that casts out fear. And that's where we should focus. Both responses seem to have a strong focus on the actions of adultery themselves. But we already see the shared sense of cherishing the wives they have in both responses, and that's what people should focus on. One more response I've seen, which I'll quickly respond to, is I've seen people say, it's time for the American church to come down harder on sin and to be more fervent in our preaching against it. But as long as the existence of sin and the need for forgiveness is already preached, then tell me one person that coming down harder on this actually helps. Because whether they were preaching vehemently against sin or not, whether they even profess belief in divine justice against sin or not, they're prone to the same sinful tendencies. There's only so much that talking about things, or telling people what you think, can do. So that is all I'm going to be doing in this video. And to the Christian world, our sinfulness is nothing but a setup to the grace of God, and it's in that spirit that I think a more helpful attitude emerges. The merit shared by both the people who say "I would never do that," and it could happen to any of us, find itself in the attitude that is thanking God for your wives, thanking God that they haven't had to suffer infidelity. That's all you can do, that's all you need to do, that's all you should do. You don't need to feel great fear of sin, nor do you have to put yourself up as a moral standard bearer for your purity. But simply knowing the blessings you have been given, and that have been given to people you hold dear to you, including yourself being in their lives. To live with an eternal attitude of thanking God means we live worshipfully, and unlike purity, that is a worthwhile end to live for. It is love that casts out fear because it is loving God, not fixating on hatred of sin as an end in itself, that dispels sin from our lives.